U.S. regulatory officials have arrived in Beijing seeking to negotiate with their Chinese counterparts on the issue of auditing compliance of U.S.-listed Chinese firms. The PCAOB will potentially send a larger team to China later this year to conduct on-site inspections of local auditors, according to a new report from Reuters, citing multiple sources. Will the regulatory standoff be resolved, or will Chinese firm finally face expulsion? Joining me today is former SEC chairman, CEO of Colorama Partners, Harvey Pitt. Thank you so much for being here with us.
It's my pleasure to be with you.
For many years, the Chinese government has resisted PCAOB's inspection of Chinese companies' auditing documents. Recently, the China Security Regulatory Commission, CSRC, the PCAOB, and the SEC reached a mutual understanding under which China would fully facilitate PCAOB inspections. Can you please unpack this new development for us? Why did the Chinese government finally relent? Does this mean China may be resuming a market-friendly stance finally?
Well, first, I think it's important to note that the agreement is only between regulatory bodies. It is not between governments, and that is a significant issue, in my view, as to how meaningful this agreement is. But looking at the agreement as it has been reported, it would permit, in certain circumstances, PCAOB reviewers to review the audits of companies that are listed or whose securities are traded in the United States. If that goes through, that would be a major breakthrough, and it might well deter some delistings. But there's so much more to this issue than just what the regulatory agreement is.
My understanding is China may still consider asking some of its companies which hold sensitive data to delist from the United States to avoid granting full access to U.S. regulators, right? So what companies or what kind of companies, in your opinion, might have to delist in the future?
Well, I think any company that may be subject to a Chinese governmental directive that it not allow certain information to be made available to PCAOB reviewers or U.S. audit firms would be companies that are likely to suffer potential delisting. I think there is a great sort of overhang about this issue, and that is the current U.S.-Russian involvements over the Ukraine. Right now, we have a lot of verbal jawboning by both governments, Russia and the U.S. And I think China will be looking to see how concerned the U.S. will be, how dramatic its actions will be, and if there's any indication of U.S. weakness, I think that will ultimately encourage the Chinese government, in connection with PCAOB reviews, to take a harder line stance. So a lot will be riding on how the U.S.-Russia-Ukraine situation unfolds.
On the surface, investors seem to have been encouraged by the news. We saw shares of Baidu, which is previously identified by the SEC as one of the non-compliants, and Alibaba surged 5 to 10% on the news that a potential deal is in the offing, while the MSCI China's ETF jumped more than 5%. Do you think the market jumped the gun here? Do you see potential complications as negotiations between the two sides continue?
Well, if you look at this as a long-term issue, I think the market did jump the gun, but in the U.S., we have become a nation of day traders, unfortunately. So people are in and out of the markets, and seeing the agreement announced, there was a judgment made that maybe these stocks could be traded in the short term as if there would be an ultimate agreement. As of now, we don't even have a full permanent agreement. We don't know what the scope of it is. So anyone who's making an investment decision for the longer term based on this is probably making a serious mistake.
I also understand the details of the potential concessions, if there are any, from China are still in flux. So how do you think Beijing will address the issue of companies operating with a so-called variable interest entity, VIE structure? Basically, when a company sets up an offshore entity to skirt rules restricting foreign investment in sensitive industries such as media, telecommunications, which is how companies like Alibaba went public in the United States.
It was thought that companies using the VIE structure would be subject to Chinese governmental directives not to move forward. The proposed agreement would have a change in this and allow companies to seek the views of the Chinese government and, at least in theory, potentially be granted permission to go public that way. Again, I think we're a long way from a final agreement, and even after a final agreement, we're a long way from seeing how the Chinese government will actually implement it. But on the surface, at least, this appears to be a potential change that might benefit that structure.
So this regulatory issue has been a major factor dragging Chinese ADRs. We see the Nasdaq Golden Dragon Index is now at the steepest discount to the S&P 500 since 2008, tumbling over 57% over the past 12 months. Should fund managers sit on their hands and wait, or should they start thinking about dip buying?
I think fund managers get paid to make these decisions, and I don't get paid to pontificate. So hopefully for fund investors, their fund managers won't rely on what I say. Notwithstanding that, my view is I think this is a potential development, but I wouldn't be making the move to be investing or be bullish about Chinese securities, Chinese ADRs, and so on. I would, as you put it, sit on my hands and wait.
In the current climate of U.S.-China relations with so many frictions, in general, what's your evaluation of long-term regulatory risks associated with Chinese ADRs? How concerned should we be?
Well, as I mentioned, I think that there should be a concern for the following reason. The Chinese government is always going to protect what it sees as its interests, which is what all governments do and should do. But the Chinese government has the capacity to lay down restrictions or lay down rules or interfere with what looks like a progressive approach to relations between the regulatory bodies. As a result of that, I think people have to proceed with caution. In my view, the best agreement that could be reached would be an agreement between the two governments, the US government and the Chinese government, as opposed to an agreement between two regulatory bodies. I think for current purposes, one takes whatever one can get. But in the long term, I think without a clear commitment from the Chinese government itself, this is always going to be a very risky proposition.
Secretary of State Blinken is set to unveil the Biden administration's China strategy in a speech within days, according to Politico, citing multiple sources. A new document titled U.S.-China Technological Decoupling, a Strategy and Policy Framework from the think tank Carnegie Endowment for International Peace argues that the United States cannot afford to muddle through tech decoupling when it comes to China. Joining me today is the author of the document, Jon Bateman, a fellow at CEIP and a former senior intelligence analyst, policy advisor, and speechwriter at the Pentagon. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks for having me.
So, John, controversies surrounding China's unfair market practice and human rights records are not new. You remember when the United States policymakers decided in the 1990s and 2000s that deepening bilateral economic engagement with China and integrating Beijing further into global institutions would be the best way forward to shape China's behaviors. Yet the mood has soured over the years. Now there seems to be this bipartisan interest in tech decoupling with China. So can you help us understand the reasons behind this sea change? How did goodwill or optimism erode and eventually collapse?
Well, that's a great question. And you're right. The concerns about China and Washington and Chinese technology are not entirely new. There have always been friction points in the relationship around such issues like human rights and unfair competition. But in the 1990s and 2000s, the prevailing mood in Washington was one of cautious optimism or, at the worst, ambivalence about China's rise and integration into the global economic order. Now, I would say we're in a world of fear and concern, and so that's a big shift. What was it that changed? I would argue that at least two key things changed, at least in the realm of technology policy. The first is that U.S. policymakers and leaders in Washington have developed much, much darker views of China over the last 5 to 10 years, and this has largely been driven by changes in Chinese behavior. So you can look at well-known developments such as Beijing's land reclamation in the South China Sea and its militarization of disputed islands, and then put that into a context of China's broader military buildup, the quality and quantity of which has caught many Westerners off guard. Then there's the continued intellectual property theft and exploitation of international trade rules. Now, again, there have always been these concerns about China and this sort of long-suffering hope that China would play by WTO rules. But what's changed is that China has actually moved up the economic value chain so that these practices that are concerning to the United States actually have greater impact than they did before. At the same time, we see a deepening authoritarianism under President Xi. So it's become clear that China is not on a path to liberalize politically. And the repression of the Uyghurs isn't a class by itself. Then we have Hong Kong and the eventual dissolution of the one country, two systems policy, and lots of saber rattling against Taiwan. So just to sum up, American policymakers have a very different view of China today than they did even 10 years ago, because China's behavior is very different. And now China is seen as the greatest long-term threat to American interests and values. The other key thing that's changed is American views of technology and tech policy. Traditionally, throughout the 90s and 2000s, the United States was the biggest supporter of digital globalization or techno-globalism. And there were lots of self-interested reasons for this. It was really the US firms and internet companies that were globally dominant and were benefiting. And this created national security benefits for the United States. At the same time, digital globalization really fit within the prevailing neoliberal paradigm. And there was lots of hope that this could spread information around the world and knit countries together. Now, China was one of a number of countries that always dissented from this techno-globalist paradigm. And we could see this early on with the development of the Great Firewall. So really, it was the United States government and policymakers in DC who were the last to come around to an ascendant techno-nationalist worldview. And there were a few key events here. Again, we already talked about the Chinese cyber-enabled IP theft. There was also Russia's election interference in 2016. Both of these events caused American elites to really see digital openness in the United States as a vulnerability, as well as only a strength. At the same time, rise of technologies like 5G and machine learning have had a huge impact on the policy conversation because these are dual use. They've been aggressively hyped as perhaps the most important technologies in a generation. And for the first time, there are signs that they could be won or dominated by China. So together, these two things, the darkening views of China and this rising techno-nationalism, have created a relative consensus in Washington that some degree of technological decoupling and techno-nationalism is the solution.
Fantastic. So you alluded to the United States' heritage of techno-nationalism, and we know the United States has successfully contested the Soviet Union, a geopolitical and ideological rival, and Japan, an economic and technological competitor. So why is this time different? How does the China challenge differ from the one posed by the Soviet Union or Japan?
Right. So this new techno-nationalism that's oriented around China, it's new, but it's not completely unprecedented. And in fact, this spectrum of techno-globalism on the one hand and techno-nationalism on the other, they've really been ebbs and flows from one side to the other throughout US history. In fact, if you go back to the 1700s and the 1800s, early US political history was dominated by questions around to what degree we should have tariffs to protect US industry and technology of that era. So now that people are looking at this China threat, the two big parallels that are being drawn are to the Cold War and to the competition with Japan in the 1980s. Of course, the Cold War led to huge federal government investments in the space race, the National Science Foundation, in Silicon Valley, the education system. It also led to some of the most significant multilateral export controls. And then likewise, Japan, when that rose as a competitor in the 1980s, really touched off similar investments. The United States put together a public-private partnership for semiconductor fabrication, and also increased restrictive measures, like the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, which now is a well-known tool in the China toolkit. But ultimately, these two prior periods are really quite distinct. Because while, as you said, the United States has successfully beaten back or contested one geopolitical adversary in the Soviet Union and one modern technological competitor in Japan, China arguably plays both of these roles and has more latent capacity than either the Soviet Union or Japan ever did. And you can look at some very basic statistics to understand this. Economically, there was a certain degree of competition between the Western-led order and the Soviet order, but we actually drastically overestimated the size of the Soviet economy, which really never reached greater than 25 or 35% the size of the US economy. And Japan never exceeded 70% the size of the US economy. Well, China is already at 70% the size of the US economy, and there's lots of varying predictions and flux about whether it will overtake the United States in the next 10 years or whether that may never happen. But there's no doubt that China's economy will continue to grow and have greater durability than certainly the creaky Soviet economy ever did, and probably Japan's as well as a competitive threat. China's population, of course, is far larger than the Soviet Union, and ultimately its global economic and diplomatic integration is completely different than what we've seen from past competitors. So again, hard to predict the future. China's economy and its tech industry specifically are facing huge headwinds right now on a lot of fronts. It's possible that China could get stuck in some kind of middle income trap, that its political influence over the technology ecosystem will ultimately stymie innovation. There could be a debt bubble that bursts, but Washington can't count on any of those things happening. So it's important to consider that this competitive threat will be enduring for a long time. The final thing I wanted to say on this is that China is different, but other aspects of the environment are different too. Unlike in the 1980s or in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, et cetera, the technological landscape is much more globalized today with globally integrated innovation and research ecosystems. It's much more private sector led. And so managing competition in this kind of environment is a completely different challenge. And the final piece is that the United States is different and has a different role in the world. Unfortunately, the governance capacity of the United States and our very political stability have greatly diminished in recent years. And we have a declining economic and political influence in the world at large by a number of different metrics. So in many ways, the geotechnological challenge facing United States leaders today is harder and more complex and more uncertain than those similar challenges that we've faced before.
These days when we read the news, it seems like the complicated reality of US-China relations has been sinking into the mire of one sensational hot take after another. So when US policymakers speak of countering China's technological threats and security risks, what tools do they actually have at their disposal, and what goals do they have in mind? In your opinion, are those the right tools for the right objectives?
Yeah, so let's start with the question of what goals they have in mind. This has to be the starting point, and unfortunately, it's often quite unclear. We've seen over the last number of years, starting in the Trump administration, many ad hoc, individual, uncoordinated actions, often taken against specific Chinese companies, whether it's TikTok or ZTE or Alibaba or others. And these don't always have a clear principle. So the fundamental question is, firstly, what kind of vision for the future does the United States have? What kind of technological relationship does the United States actually want to have with China? I argue that there's three different paths that we can take. One path would be called cooperationism. And this would involve continued technological engagement with China on the premise that this is win-win and beneficial for the United States, and there should not be significant technology restrictions. This path was once dominant, but has really lost a lot of political influence. The opposite path is what might be called restrictionism, which is essentially pulling back the drawbridge and raising the moat and imposing drastically greater technology restrictions on our relationship with China. So we see now a debate about, for example, whether there should be outbound investment screening to prevent Americans and American financial institutions from investing in large swaths of the Chinese technology economy. And then in the middle is a centrist path, where it's sometimes called a small yard with a high fence. In other words, we would only seek to restrict and selectively decouple in a few of the most strategic and sensitive technology areas. And in other areas, we would allow cooperation to continue where it's seen as mutually beneficial for US interests and for Chinese and other global interests. So we still have really not decided as a country which path that we're on. And the major debate is between these restrictionists on the one hand and the centrists on the other. And I'll say that both camps are represented inside the Biden administration and inside Congress in both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Now, if you were to try to then break down these goals into more specific policy objectives, you would very quickly see that there's many, many different complicated technology policy goals at stake, and sometimes these can conflict with each other. And so there needs to be a sense of priorities and trade-offs. For example, we want to protect US-sensitive technology in order to maintain a military edge, but we also want to compete economically on the world stage. You can look at past decades when strict regulation of the export of commercial satellite imagery, which was something the US government did to protect its military and intelligence advantages, ultimately ceded market share to European and other foreign competitors. So that's an example of the trade-off between some of these goals and why we need to be clear about them. Now, you asked what tools we have. In general, I think you can break it into two pieces, offense and defense. Offense, which we can talk more about, is self-improvement, investing in United States technological strength, resilience, and competitiveness. We need to do much, much more of that. Unfortunately, most of the energy so far has been spent on what you might call defense, essentially protecting US technological advantages from some kind of Chinese encroachment, theft, or in some cases, holding down or thwarting Chinese technological influence or progress. And there's a huge array of these tools, from export controls, tariffs, restrictions on investment both ways, denying Chinese companies licenses to operate in the United States, denying visas for Chinese students and researchers, financial sanctions, rules on how federal spending and grants can be spent when it comes to China, and law enforcement actions like the China Initiative. In all of these areas, what we've seen over the past 5, 6, 7 years is an expansion of these authorities and an intensification of how they're being applied against China and the Chinese tech sector. So there are a lot of tools. They're very complicated and arcane, And unfortunately, without a clear strategy, these tools will probably be used in an ad hoc manner that's not coordinated or coherent and could send mixed messages around the world.
I see. In the paper you wrote, you also remind us that tackling the China challenge is not all about disciplining China's unfair practice. Even on a level playing field, China can still outcompete the United States in some areas of technology deemed to matter most for the future. I wonder if you can give us some examples of areas you see China potentially overtaking the United States, and what's your policy prescription to U.S. policymakers?
Well, it's a very simple but obvious, often glossed over point, which is that we speak in terms of stopping Chinese unfair economic practices, whether these are subsidies, market access restrictions, discriminatory regulatory requirements, IP theft. We also speak in terms of winning economic competition and making sure that we're successful in the most important industries of the future. These two things are related, but they are different, right? There are cases where even under a level playing field, another country, including China, might outcompete us simply by virtue of natural advantages that it has, whether it's China's, the fact that China is among the top countries in the world in STEM PhDs, whether it's one of the top countries in the world in R&D spending, and other things that it's done, particularly in the realm of supply chain integration and manufacturing integration. So we need to pull these things apart and make sure that we're addressing each differently. And you asked for an example. I'll give you a couple examples. One is TikTok. TikTok, of course, a Chinese social media platform, has really exploded in the last few years in terms of popularity to become by far the most significant competitive threat to the dominant US-based social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter to emerge in years. Now, it's interesting in that the basic ideas for TikTok, like short, shareable videos that would target youth, these ideas have been around for a long time. And in the US, we even had a company called Vine a number of years ago that popped up, was successful for a while, and then faded away. So what TikTok has done is enter this marketplace and really competed very successfully in it. It's done what Vine attempted to do, but in a way that's actually captured market share in the United States and globally. So now TikTok is the fastest growing social media company in the United States and a huge competitive threat. Now, there's lots of controversies around TikTok in the United States. There's concerns about the data practices, about youth addiction, content moderation. So TikTok is not a controversy-free company, but there have not been significant allegations of unfair practices. For example, there has not been any revelation that TikTok has received some kind of subsidy or support from the Chinese government or benefited from IP theft. So that's an example of a company that simply arises organically within China's innovation ecosystem. And the United States has to be prepared to tackle those competitive threats and win on our own terms. Another example would be DJI, the drone manufacturer. Now, this example is a little bit less clear-cut because DJI is a somewhat opaque, privately held company, and we've learned recently that there were some Chinese government investments in DJI. But by and large, it appears as though China has become the globally dominant drone manufacturer, in large part by doing simple things very effectively. This means having innovative designs, having a tremendous amount of R&D that's successful, and having a really well-honed supply chain and manufacturing integrative process. So ultimately, to respond to these competitive threats, the United States needs to do two things at the same time. It needs to seek to enforce rules under the global trade order and perhaps modify those rules when current bodies like the World Trade Organization aren't effective in reining in some of the most systemic and subversive Chinese unfair economic practices. And occasionally, this will mean unilateral measures like some of the tariffs and export controls that we've been describing. But really what the United States needs to do more than anything else is invest in and nurture its own innovation ecosystem so that it can compete on its own terms with Chinese companies. And that may look differently in the drone marketplace as in the social media marketplace. But there's a lot that the United States can do to invest in itself.
Right. You mentioned those self-improvement or offensive policies will have the greatest long-term potential for strengthening U.S. resilience and competitiveness. What are the main hurdles to actually implementing them?
Yeah, so there's so much the United States needs to do in what I call offense or self-improvement to strengthen U.S. technological competitiveness, leadership, resilience. The first thing that we need to do is just spend a lot of money. And this can be done in different ways, but essentially what we need to support is research and development, which at a federal level has declined over the decades. We need to rebuild our manufacturing capacity, at the very least in those industries where for national security and economic security reasons, we need to have some kind of secure manufacturing capacity, like with the semiconductor industry. We also need to reinvest in our education system, particularly technical and STEM education, to make sure that we're churning out the best and the brightest to create the new innovations of the future. At the same time, we need to do a lot of investments and spend a lot of money in the realm of security. So a lot of the decoupling agenda is driven on fears of Chinese sabotage or military operations or intelligence operations. And so we need to combat those, but we also at home need to build up our own critical infrastructure resilience. We need to continue to transform our own military forces to compete more effectively against the PLA, and we need to invest in counterintelligence capabilities. So that's all in the category of spending money. And there's some signs that this is on the way. Some of the China bills that Congress is considering are a down payment on the R&D, the manufacturing, and the supply chain resilience. There's also things that we need to do in the realm of regulation. So if we're worried about China stealing our personal data or hacking our networks through some kind of backdoor, it should be of concern to Americans that we have no coherent national cybersecurity and data privacy standards that apply to a broad range of data, including critical infrastructure information and personally identifiable information. So Congress needs to get on that. If we're concerned about Chinese influence operations subverting US elections or political conversations, well, there's a lot that we need to do at home to regulate our own platforms, reform campaign finance, and restore trust in our own information. And you can go on down the line in terms of antitrust, making sure that we're respecting human rights, building coalitions abroad. These are all things that are complementary to, and in some ways more important than the restrictive measures that we would take to target or thwart or combat China directly. And my argument is ultimately that these restrictive measures, although important, really are limited band-aids. So export controls, investment restrictions, visa limits, these should be used to buy time for these other long-term investments to bear fruit, to pay off. I'm cautiously optimistic about some of this because of the progress on Capitol Hill of these two China bills, but we'll find out over the next few months if these actually are signed into law or not. You asked what the barriers are. Unfortunately, anyone who studies US politics knows that it's become increasingly difficult to get any big things done in the US government. There's tremendous polarization in Congress. And although there's a bipartisan consensus that we need to better compete and protect ourselves against Chinese technology, sometimes one party or the other can use this as a political football and seek to deny one party a win before the midterm election. So I'm worried about that. I'm also worried that traditional US debates, like for example, about the role of unions in our economy, could actually prevent some of this funding from being passed because we already see controversies over whether supply chain resilience funds should be attached to unionization requirements. So all of the same political battles that unfortunately Americans sometimes get stuck on are going to reassert themselves when some of these national security issues really become domestic policy issues at the advent of a new era of industrial strategy. So in order to overcome that, we'll need to develop US domestic consensus around the urgency of tackling the competitive and national security threats from China, and we'll need to have good faith negotiations across both parties. What happens with these two China bills, USICA and the America Competes Act, in the next few months will be a big signal about which path we're headed down.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mr. Bateman, for this very insightful conversation. We will include a link to your report in the show notes section of this program so our audience can take a closer look if they want. Thank you so much for being here with us, Mr. Bateman. I look forward to talking with you in the future. Today is day 68 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Evacuation of civilians continue from the besieged city of Mariupol. In the United States, leaders are working to put their promises of aid to Ukraine into action. In Brussels, EU energy ministers are making preparations to potentially impose an embargo on Russian oil this week, a once unthinkable step for a bloc whose member states have long depended on Russian energy. Joining me now to discuss the recent development of the Russo-Ukrainian war is researcher and journalist Kamil Galeev. Kamil, thank you so much for being with us. Before we start, Kamil, can you just briefly introduce yourself to our audience?
Thank you. So my name is Kamil Galeev. I'm an independent researcher, originally from Tatarstan, an autonomous ethnic republic in Russia. So at this moment, I am mostly covering the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and the situation in Russia for international audience.
Fascinating. So, Kamil, you've been writing these fascinating Twitter threads on Russia's history, ideology, and your musings on the directions of the war. Roughly a month ago, you laid out 3 possible scenarios for Russia's future. For those of our audience who have not yet read your writing, here's a quick recap. The first scenario is a North Korea scenario in which Putin tightens his grip on power, independent media is squelched, Z soldiers become heroes. The second scenario is what you call an imperial reboot, with a potentially more liberal face replacing Putin, but no substantial change in the direction of the country. The third, more desirable scenario is a so-called national divorce, an imperial breakup that would follow, quote, the same patterns like the one in Latin America, unquote. So now we are over 2 months into the war. What's your current assessment of the most likely outcome of this war?
Yeah, first of all, let me make a small clarification. So basically, thank you for introducing these 3 scenarios. Regarding North Korea, I should note that I use this name largely for an international audience. And indeed, I meant that from the international perspective, from the perspective of foreign countries, in case Putin keeps power for, let's say, another few years, Russia will look more and more North Korea, both like as international troublemaker and regarding its close alliance with China, which would be its only reliable partner. However, from the domestic perspective, it could look a little bit differently. From the perspective of Russians, if Putin kept power, Russia would look not so much as North Korea, but largely as one huge Donbass. So Donbass is part of eastern Ukraine that was sort of occupied by Russia, but Russians didn't recognize the occupation. They proclaimed unrecognized quasi-independent states there, Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic. And those are heavily statist, hyper-militarized societies aimed for total mobilization for the war with Ukraine. And that's probably what Russia will look like in maybe a few years if Putin keeps power. However, now I find such a scenario much less likely than a month before. Why? Because in order for this scenario to happen, Putin should keep his legitimacy, and Russian regime should keep its legitimacy, which I now find much less probable than a month ago. Not because they showed themselves cruel or criminal, but rather because they showed themselves weak. When Putin launched his Z operation, Russians expected a quick victory over supposedly so much weaker and inferior Ukraine. But a quick victory didn't happen. Moreover, Ukrainians are launching successful strikes on Russia proper. And apart from logistical problems and infrastructure problems it's creating for Russian war efforts, it also has a major psychological effect. It means if Ukraine is able to launch strikes on Russia, for example, like Ukrainian helicopters, they attacked Russian oil bases in Belgorod near the border and returned back successfully. And if they manage to do that, it probably means Ukraine is not that weak as we expected, and Russia is not that great as we expected. And I find this a major factor in predicting the future of Russia, because Russian public opinion absolutely can forgive its ruler poverty, it can forgive repressions, it can forgive atrocities. It's not going to forgive a military defeat. And now it looks like the perspective of military defeat from Ukraine is more and more probable. I don't think Russian public opinion will forgive Putin that. So now, as North Korea scenario in which Putin keeps power, I think it looks less probable. So we have two further scenarios: imperial reboot and national divorce. Imperial reboot can happen should some liberal positioner, especially from Moscow, succeed Putin as a new ruler of Russia. We might have partial change of elites. However, in practice, in this case, most of Russian imperial machine, and specifically its asymmetrical relations between the imperial metropoly and the colonial periphery, they will remain more or less the same. Why? Because ultimately, Moscow liberals and Moscow, let's say, statist ruling establishment, they're just two faces of the same double-faced Janus of Russian state. They ultimately share all the same assumptions about big central Russia, about its uniformity, about its homogeneity. And Putin, as well as liberal opposition, they both view any form of provincial pride, provincial agency, independent action as threats to be eliminated. You may think that I'm exaggerating, but one of very few instances in which Moscow liberal establishment supported Putin and endorsed his policies was when he was dismantling the cultural infrastructure of Russian minorities. So colonial rule over periphery, extirpating of non-Russian cultures is something both Putin and liberal opposition agree on. So in case if liberal opposition takes power, I don't expect dismantling of imperial rule. I expect the imperial reboot. But there is important factor here. Important factor is the following. After each collapse, big collapse of 1917, big collapse of 1991, Russia, of course, temporarily becomes weaker, but then it usually has a reboot. The question is, how many reboots does Russia still have? That's a good question. We have some reason to believe there are not so many options for reboots left. First of all, Russian demographic balance is changing. Quite recently, Russia used to be the country of overwhelmingly ethnic Russians, or at least East Slavs. Now it's changing quickly. For example, if you look at the casualty lists in Ukraine, of course, we don't have full casualty lists for all Russia, but regions the most represented are ethnic periphery. Buryatia, Dagestan, and so on, especially two clusters in South Siberia and South Caucasus. It happens for many reasons: economic, they're just poorer. Probably Kremlin finds them most disposable, but also an important factor is ethnic Russians are depopulating. Russia demographically becomes less and less ethnic Russian country. And that's an important factor that will influence the future of the country. Another factor is economic. Russia, for the last decades, was heavily reliant on export of natural resources, most importantly, natural oil and natural gas. However, now Russia ran out of the deposits of cheap oil and cheap gas. Almost all of deposits it still has, though huge theoretically, they lie in Arctic, with the cost of production growing enormously, which means that delta between the cost of production and cost of export on which Russian state relied on, it's plummeting and plummeting quickly.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the economic consequences of the war, as you briefly alluded to there. You know, since the beginning of the war, the West has launched a campaign to isolate Russia financially by blacklisting some of Russia's largest banks, severing Russia's businesses from the global supply chain, and weaning off Russian energy. It seems quite clear that Western sanctions have inflicted significant economic damage to Russia's economy, as you alluded to. And the IMF actually forecasts a decline in Russia's GDP of as much as 10 percentage points this year. But it's not lost on many of us that Putin has not retreated from his invasion. And Ukrainian lives are still suffering on a day-to-day basis. So why haven't the economic consequences of sanctions sunk in? What's actually driving Mr. Putin to double down on the battlefield? potentially to the detriment of his country's future?
Well, regarding Putin's intentions, I think his motivation is quite clear. He can't back off because Russian public opinion is not going to forgive its Tsar their defeat in a small victorious war. He has no chance to back off. He has no option. But regarding the economic effect of sanctions, I would say the most vulnerable point of Russia is technological import. In fact, the effect of sanctions was visible from 2014, long before the war started. For example, Obama's introduced sanctions back then were often criticized for failing to stop Russia. That's not true. In fact, they're quite effective in undermining its military efforts even back then. For example, many of Russian military production facilities, for example, in Ural, they suffered major losses because of sanctions, because production of new types of armament, it heavily relied on imported components. For example, production of new Armata tanks, it was never scaled up. They produced, I think, several dozen copies. They planned to produce some thousands of them, but they were never mass produced since they relied on imported electronic components, and importing them, getting them was just too difficult. That's first thing. Sanctions introduced in 2014, they didn't destroy Russian military machine, but they significantly hampered Russian rearmament. Furthermore, now Russia's gonna suffer serious problems because its technological chains, and I mean not only military production, I mean like any sort of production, they heavily rely on foreign components. For example, Russia almost doesn't produce its own industrial machines. So its industrial production relies either on Soviet machines that mostly are not produced since 1990s, or on imported foreign ones. And now it will be much, much more difficult to import them. Russia doesn't produce cassette bearings. Russia doesn't produce ball screws, and so on. I mean, most probably, Russian technological chains will gradually stop, and they're already stopping. For example, Ural Vagon Zavod, which produces tanks, stop its production assembly lines. Russian technological chains will stop not because of some fancy stuff, but because of the lack of some dumb, lame stuff, like bearings or ball screws. That impacts military production, that impacts, for example, railway production, because new Russian rail cars, they all use cassette bearings, and its own production in Russia now almost stopped because it was still foreign produced. Its import is now stopping. Russia will not have its own aviation because Russia overwhelmingly relied on Boeings and Airbuses. Now they can't be used. I mean, new ones can't be imported, and equipment for them, details for them can't be imported. So, I mean, the effect of sanctions is already visible, but it will be even more visible in a few months through stopping of Russian technological chains and supply chains.
I wanted to turn to symbolism a little bit. You wrote a while ago that the motivation behind the so-called Z war is not security, not alliances or political affiliation. Rather, it's, quote, the need to extinguish wrong cultural memes and impose correct ones. And that's why Z war has such wide popular support from Russians, and why Russians so easily agreed to a total war of destruction against Ukraine, unquote. I wonder if you can elaborate on that sentence a bit more. What's the cultural or contextual underpinning of the Z mindset? And how did Putin weaponize that mindset?
I think such complex phenomena like the one you just described, they're easiest understandable if you just look at physical map. I mean, if you open physical map of Russia and Ukraine, you'll see the following. It's basically a huge plain on the East Ukrainian and the Southwest Russia. It's largely just a steppe with no significant natural boundaries, which means that historically there are no significant boundaries between Russia and Ukraine. Like ethnically speaking, linguistically speaking, it was basically the same continuum of Slavic dialects, which stretched from probably what's now Carpathian mountains eastward. So, I mean, there was no clear boundary. It wasn't homogeneous, of course. There were many dialects, there were many small cultures, but there was no one clear, visible line. For example, as an example of this line, I mean, in West Europe, it could be probably Rhine River, or maybe like Pyrenees Mountains. But between Russia and Ukraine, there is no such boundaries. There is nothing like that. This space was not really politically united before Russia annexed much of Ukraine in 17th century, but it was religiously united. What is now Russia, what is now Belarus, Ukraine, also Romania and Bulgaria at least, they belong to the same, as Benedict Anderson would say, sacred community of Church Slavonic language. It's crucially important. It was the language of high culture, of liturgy, and largely of literary culture. For example, I mean, like how medieval Russians would call Western Europeans, be it French, German, Poles, Swedes, doesn't matter at all. They would call them Latins. It didn't matter at all which languages did they speak in their like normal life. Poles or Germans didn't speak Latin in their normal life. But in Middle Ages, all of this Western Europe, all of this Catholic Europe, it used Latin as the language of religion. And in the eyes of Russians, it's kind of united them all in one religious and sacred community. So in a way, as Western Europe was united by Latin, much of Eastern Europe, all the way from Bulgaria to Russia, was united by Church Slavonic. And this sacred community in medieval Russia was called as Rus. It was a religious term. But in modern period, first Russian monarchs and then Russian nation state, it used memory about this ancient sacred community in order to justify its imperial ambitions. So what Russian emperors wanted to do, at least since Catherine II, what largely USSR wanted to do, what modern Russia wants to do now, it's to extirpate all the vernaculars, extirpate all the cultural variety on this space, at least of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, and on the space of this old sacred community, establish one Russian language, one Russian culture, one set of memes.
I see. So that certainly sounds very concerning. But I mean, more to the point of what's going on the battlefield, here's an elephant in the room. We are roughly a week away from May the 9th, the so-called Victory Day. What would constitute an acceptable piece of progress on the battleground for Putin to declare victory at home? What is the possibility that Mr. Putin will deploy tactical nuclear weapons against Ukrainian cities?
Well, to start with, I think maybe it makes sense to make a small introduction about how the battlefield looks like even. At this point, in East Ukraine, it looks not so much even as battlefields of Second World War, but in a sense like battlefields of First World War. So why? Because a Russian advance in Donbass, in East Ukraine, it was very predictable since 2014 at least. It was so much predictable that Ukrainians prepared very, very well. I mean, for example, if you look Russian video recordings of abandoned Ukrainian fortifications, you'll see they're extremely good. There are many hundred kilometers of trenches, very deep one, buttressed by concrete, and it's high quality concrete, very well prepared bunkers, which means that breaking through these lines, it's extremely difficult because they can survive very high amount of shelling, of bombing, which is happening really. So what has been happening since that Russians were totally mobilizing basically East Ukrainians from Donbass and sending them in frontline assaults to these Ukrainian fortifications where they were basically massacred. Russians didn't really reach any significant advance in Donbass despite extreme casualties, extremely high. So what could Russians do? Theoretically, as you mentioned, it could make sense to do a tactical nuclear strike. But again, that's very predictable. The problem is Ukrainians, for this reason, don't concentrate their forces too densely, which means that either you have to do a massive use of tactical nukes, which I don't think it's probably going to happen, or you can just make some show of force by destroying cities. So unfortunately, at this point, I can't exclude it's going to happen. But there are, it will be clearly raising stakes very high. And it will be clearly raising stakes very high, not only for Putin, but for the entire political elite and establishment of Russia. because at this point, many of them can hope that through this or other means they could clear themselves in case of defeat and save at least their lives. Or let's be realists, many of them absolutely can keep their wealth, their status, and their authority, maybe just by changing banners. But if they really start employing nukes, that's probably not going to happen. So the question is, Putin may be ready to do it, but the question is, will Russian leadership, including military leadership, including state security leadership, agree to that, or will they sabotage? I don't have data. I don't have confirmed and hard data on any real military sabotage from the Russian military, but I have some on sorts of self-interest sabotage from Russian civilian functionaries in Russia proper, and it's happening a lot. It's happening en masse. So if I could outline the scenario of how Russia could be disrupted by this war, of how Russia could be destroyed by this war, I wouldn't say it can be disrupted by some popular rebellion. That's not going to happen. It wouldn't be destroyed by, let's say, politically motivated betrayal of its own functionaries. I also don't think it's going to happen, but it will be destroyed by its functionaries pursuing their own self-interest. For example, that's very important, so I wanted to clarify that. For example, you probably saw some info about the lack of sugar, shortage of sugar in Russia, which was indeed very visible. How it happened? Russia is a major producer of sugar, and its own production covers more than enough. How could it even happen? Well, because the production of sugar is concentrated only in a few southern regions. And when first news about supposed deficit happened, they basically sabotaged export of sugar to other regions. It makes sense. If I'm a governor or some local functionary, I care about this region because I'll be held accountable if something happens there. So if I have a suspicion that some resource, sugar or whatever else, can be of deficit, I'll absolutely prohibit supplying it to other regions. Sugar is obvious, but that will be happening, and that's already happening on every level with every deficit resources. And that's one of the worst for Russia consequences of sanctions. The moment deficit becomes visible, any functionaries on city, on regional level, they will turn off maximum economic protectionism.
I wanted to turn to Russia-China relations. How is relation to China perceived by Mr. Putin and the Russian public in general? And will this war bring about new configurations of Russia-China relations? And what do those configurations look like?
Well, regarding public opinion, I would say that much of, let's say, patriotic, statist, pro-Putin public opinion, it largely considered China, especially before the war, as a sort of parent figure, which would help us, which would protect us, which would supply us in the case of conflict with the West. And I think at this point, they may feel a little bit betrayed by China. China, of course, didn't promise anything, but many expected it would help Russia much, much more. It didn't really happen. Why didn't it happen? Well, even though public, let's say, patriotic opinion, imperialist opinion, it was pro-China, if we look at Russian elites, they were very, very much divided. Some institutions, for example, Security Council, they, before this conflict, generally try to boost the cooperation with China as much as possible. But other agencies, for example, Federal State Security, Federal Service of Security, FSB, they probably were against. Of course, they would never raise any sort of argument. But it seems that they were sabotaging cooperation with China because they perceived cooperation with China as sort of security risk for Russia itself. Mm-hmm. That's obvious. China is too big, too strong, too rich, and presents a security risk to Russia. They didn't know that conflict with the West will happen so abruptly and will have so great consequences. So they maybe miscalculated their risks. And if Russian institutions within Russian government wouldn't sabotage cooperation with China, most probably Russia wouldn't be doing so bad because almost no preparation regarding economic integration with China had been done before the war. Let me give you an example. At this point, maybe a month, at the moment the war started, there were no functioning railway bridges on Russia-Chinese border through Amur River in Amur region. There was, of course, a project of cooperation. China had to build its own part, I think maybe like 70%, and Russia had to build its own part, like 30% of length. China built its own 70% many years ago. Russia didn't even start. After the conflict started, they started building it very, very quickly, and now the bridge is finished. But the infrastructure to make the railway connection and connect Russian railway with Chinese, it most probably is not ready yet. And that kind of shows how unprepared was all this Russian-Chinese cooperation, which was talked so much about. They talked about cooperation, but they didn't finish one single railway bridge. They started really working on it only after the war started. And maybe it's just too late. If Putin keeps power, I'm absolutely sure that China will become probably his only reliable trade partner. Trade, commercial, technological. There are, of course, problems with that. For example, some argue that China could fill the gaps in Russian technological chains created by breaking their commercial contracts with the West. Well, that could happen, but it can't happen now because there are many things China just is not producing, like microchipped, like commercial planes. China doesn't even produce enough industrial machines and machines for precision manufacturing. So I don't think China could really cover and fill the gaps in Russian technological chains right now.
I see. Well, this is such a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, Kamil. And we will make sure to include your Twitter handle in the show notes section of this program so our audience can take a closer look at your Twitter account and read your fascinating threads. Thank you so much.